So Atlas has finally released their new title, Metaphor Refantazio. So Atlas has been teasing this game for a couple of years now. It's been in development, I think, for almost like 8 or 10 years, which is kind of insane. It was a huge project that was being taught because there were so many names attached to it. I mean, we had people from the art department from Near Automata working into this, and other projects as well, kind of like joining in here to just make the most out of it. And it was very interesting that Atlas just had the sense of collaboration with other talented individuals from other well-known video games, especially since they've been kind of like handling it themselves with Shin Megami Tensei and Persona and still pumping out classic games. What's even more interesting is their track record this year alone. They've released Persona 3 Reload, Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance, which is a re-release of the original version Nintendo Switch, and other titles as well. And the mere fact that they're kind of wrapping up this year with Metaphor says a lot because, wow, this game packs one hell of a punch. I was one of the people who played the demo before this game was released, and I gotta say, I was very impressed by that demo, but it had some technical issues. I did notice the performance was kind of a bit weird and a bit like just 50-50. Sometimes it would be like a lot of frames that would just drop when you were like loading into some areas, which is a bit distracting. And there were occasions where the AI was a bit reluctant or would kind of freeze for a couple of seconds before even initiating an attack. These were like occasional moments, and keep in mind that demo was like 5 hours. It was like 5 hours worth of content, which is freaking mind-blowing to say the least, but it really showed a lot of what Metaphor was, despite the tutorial area kind of being like very long, kind of like feeling like Persona 5 with the first dungeon almost taking like 10 hours or feeling like it takes 10 hours of the gameplay, but it kind of like showed you or give you a sense of feeling what was going on. So kind of jumping from the demo to this game, was just curious of how it was going to continue, and it just really exceeded my expectations. Now I have a couple of things to list in terms of pros and cons, and I want to start off with some slight cons. I know it's not the most positive way to kind of start off a review, but I just want to get this thing out of the way. I did mention there's performing issues in the demo, and those are still prevalent into the game, but thankfully the updates that Atlus has been rolling out for this game has been very effective, because the frame drops when you're loading from areas is kind of like just disappeared. I don't think I've ever seen a frame drop ever again after like the first update or two, which is very impressive. But I will say there were still some areas, especially when you kind of descend into like the final parts of the game, kind of like where you reach end game. Like there are some severe frame drops where you're kind of like transitioning from place to place, especially since there's so many things to load up to in the game. Another con that I kind of want to say, despite the areas kind of being visually impressive, and there's like a handful of things to do. I would say even more things to do in this game than you would like in a game like Persona 5, which is like the Persona game with more things to do. I will say that I kind of felt like the dungeons and some extracurricular activities could have been polished a bit more. There were some dungeons in some places that kind of felt like the same thing that I just played previously, just kind of said differently, and the puzzles kind of became a bit more predictable, and there were just some moments in some parts of like the dungeon that just became kind of annoying and a bit flavorless, which was a bit of a letdown. Now, it's not to say that it's not enjoyable. I think the boss fights, for the most part, were pretty cool, pretty enjoyable. For side activities, it was very rewarding. There's a lot of like just money to be earned from these bounties or quests or whatever you're kind of looking for. I always had like a motivation to go after these bounties or quests. Actually, I think I completed almost all the bounties that the game has to offer because it was so rewarding, especially when you level up with other characters and your social links and stuff like that. The reward becomes much more enticing. So I will give him that. But I do definitely think that when you're kind of like just going through the dungeon, there are many moments where I felt like I just wanted to skip every single floor and go straight to the final boss because of how frustrating sometimes it felt to navigate. So I want to talk more about the story and the narrative itself. I'm not going to mention like spoilers or anything like that. It's just some things that are like common sense or have already been said by trailers or just the demo in general. Basically, the story follows that the king is slayed by his kind of like commander, this like general, like military, like commander, whatever, called Luis, and he slayed the king because he kind of saw him as like being fragile, and like the need of a stronger, more youthful leader, which is supposed to be Louis, or what he sees himself being in the future. And his proposition is that everybody, like every tribe, will be equal. There's no discrimination, and him kind of combating like racism with nihilism in a sense. And the main mission for the protagonist in the group is to basically stop Louise and to cure the prince, because the prince allegedly was poisoned by Louise. It basically follows this very like fantastical, like fantasy-esque tale. Obviously it's literally called like metaphor Refantazio. It's obviously going to be very fantasy-like, and it has like a lot of moments in which I was like, damn, this story is like, despite it being like very fantastical and a bit whimsical, it's very, very dark for a rated T game. I was surprised this game was going to be rated T, but there's like a lot of moments where there's like implied gore, or there's like just a lot of dark themes involved in there as narrative as you kind of play along. And I was like, are you sure this is rated T? Like, this game feels darker than Persona or the other like games from Atlus that are like rated M. So it was like a big shocker for me. And I think that it handled these dark themes pretty well, even for such a whimsical element being attached to it. I think this game has like a bunch of plot twists throughout the story. Again, I'm not going to mention none of the plot twists because I don't want to ruin the experience for anybody. But it has like an insane amount of plot twists. A lot of people were saying that this game is around like 60 hours. It took me like 80 hours to complete. That's kind of including grinding and a bunch of other things. A criticism that I do have about the story is that this game kind of like baits you. It kind of baits you into thinking that you're like in the end game process, but you're like missing so much more of the game, and it keeps on telling you like, this is gonna be the final part, this is gonna be the final part. You're kind of getting close to the final part, and you're like far away from the final part. You're like probably 20 hours away from the final part, and it's something that I kind of dreaded when I was playing this game, because I was like, okay, when is this game really going to end? Like, I'm loving this game and the experience, but it's like I'm being constantly like gaslit by the game into thinking it's going to be the final experience. I kind of found that thing to be a bit annoying, especially since like it hypes up some of the areas that are very cool, very anti-dramatic and anticlimactic, into being like the final part of it was just like confusing so many times into thinking like, when is the game going to stop? In terms of social links, which makes Atlus games very recognizable, especially the Persona series, and it is borrowing some elements of Persona series. Metaphor has some pretty cool, unique social links, especially since like the cast of characters, who again I won't mention because there are actually some spoilers, are just very lovable. There's a very lovable characters and very interesting characters that you really want to explore and understand more. I think I almost maxed out every single social link for the main group, and it was just an experience that was just so worth it. It was so worthwhile because it was like lores and backgrounds that I wanted to understand and know into more depth. And the game does a pretty good job at explaining the motivations and personal character arcs of these characters. A thing that I will criticize is that, unlike Persona 3, there isn't like there aren't voice lines in the social link, except for like the initiating the social link and like wrapping up the social link. And it kind of frustrated me and annoyed me a bit, because what made Persona 3 Reload so unique was that everything was voiced. Maybe it's because of a budget thing, and Metaphor is technically a bigger game than Persona 3 in terms of a world building and the amount of content it offers. So maybe they were a bit like strict in the budget, especially since they probably dumped so much money on the anime cutscenes, because the anime cutscenes are pretty lengthy sometimes, and they're pretty well animated and executed. But yeah, I kind of wish sometimes there was like some dialogue that was being voiced. It kind of felt a bit awkward of it not being voiced, especially some pivotal moments along the social links. I think like in the main story in general, there were some lines that like, you know, the game wants you to feel like a bit tense, but there's like no words coming out. And it's like, it feels so awkward, and you have to like rely on these awkward facial expressions to kind of like tell the entire story. And I thought it was like a bit just strange. The voice acting in this game, I would say, is superb, like always when it comes to Atlus games. I don't think they were kind of like phoning it in many times. I think it was actually very natural, especially since they probably didn't have to use like Japanese like suffixes like kun or san. It doesn't sound like, I guess, a bit corny or cringy like some Persona games sound. But in this case, like, since it's mainly like a British cast and it's like taking time in the medieval times or whatever, it feels much more natural, and it feels like its own separate IP and thing. It's obviously its own separate IP, but just I think the voice acting like makes it really feel like it's its own separate thing. It really isn't anything that much to compare when it comes to comparing the other games that Atlus has in its own roster. I think emotionally, most of these characters, like the emotion is really captured well in terms of dialogue and voice. And for a first time forever, apparently, in an Atlus game, like the main character is actually like voiced throughout. Like almost every decision you make is voiced. You can kind of hear some slightly different interpretations with the main character and their decisions and stuff, and it sounds very unique. And I like that it doesn't sound like it's like socially isolated from the other characters. Like when you make a decision, like the characters react according to your decision in a very natural way, not like in a very phoned in a way that they kind of like avoid you or evade you or just you sound like out of place. I was very impressed by that actually. So the gameplay borrows elements from the other games that Atlus made. Obviously, they were pretty abrasive about it. But I think this game feels more like an actual JRPG adventure than it does a simulator, like a day-to-day simulator that you would see in Persona. It's really its own thing. Like there's a lot of gameplay to be had. Like the game, really wants you. The game really wants you to go out there and explore the world. It kind of works like Persona in terms of it sometimes taking days to discover some specific areas and dungeons, even though you can kind of teleport sometimes. But there's again, the game promotes the idea of you getting out there, doing a bunch of things, do the social links, but also do a lot of the exploring the dungeons, explore new areas that you haven't seen, a bunch of things. And it has these occasional like visual sim, visual novel-esque pieces for it's like the entire crew kind of speaking about a site they just explored or saw, and these are very visually striking images that I was like, damn, I really wish you could kind of explore those areas. But I understand budgetary constraints and stuff, and it will probably be way too big for the game. But for the areas that you can explore, it's pretty impressive. I think the main dungeons or palaces or whatever you want to call it are very cool too. There's some unique elements attached to it. There's some areas that it's you got to do some sneaking and stuff, and while it might feel a little bit strange or a bit robotic, I think for the most part, since it's kind of concise and short, it doesn't interfere with the gameplay. A criticism that I do have of the gameplay though is the level disparity there is between the main character and the enemies. Now I understand when it comes to JRPGs, obviously there's going to be enemies that are much higher level than you, and it has to create this sort of tension or challenge for the player. But there are just so many occasions where it's you go to a new area in the dungeon, and there's enemies that are 15 levels higher than the main character, and I'm like, what the hell? I literally just leveled up a couple minutes ago just to be in around the same level. How is this even possible? And it really feels that way the more you progress throughout the game, especially during endgame, true endgame. It was a huge level of disparity, and I had to grind there for a couple hours almost, so I could try to be near the lengths of not only the final boss, but the enemies around me. To be fair, it kind of works both ways. I mean, if you are over leveled, you're probably going to find this game to be a complete joke, since you can easily exploit the weaknesses, or as the new features imply, you can create new weaknesses and just exploit those new weaknesses, which I thought was a very interesting new mechanic they added, creating your own weaknesses if they're the enemy doesn't have a weakness, and it almost applies for almost any single boss you fight, and I thought it was very cool, so you're not endlessly frustrated during the fight and stuff. I think it opens so many opportunities and windows for strategies, and that's what makes me that's the impression that I got from this game. I felt like it was borrowing a lot of elements from classic JRPGs such as Final Fantasy, in which the formation, the way you can set up your teams, the customization, the bunch of elements that you have to, I guess, develop a strategy to fight against an opponent is very creative and very fun and innovative. There were some boss fights that felt a bit too familiar, or they just kind of felt like a joke at times. It was I fought a side boss that was much harder than this boss, and I was is this for real? But I think as you progress, you either get a very annoying boss, a challenging, or a fun, challenging boss. It's there's no specific parameter, if I'm being honest with you. I do have to warn people who are trying to get into this game, if you're thinking this is Persona, difficulty wise, you get that image out of your head. Prepare to grind occasionally, because it's you really don't want to be the person stuck in a boss fight because you're under leveled and you probably didn't save well or whatever, because that happened to me one or two occasions, and I was like, damn, I'm really getting screwed in here. So my advice is to prepare, actually prepare, Like a lot of people criticize Persona 3 Reload for being kind of brain dead sometimes, and I do agree that game was ridiculously easy occasion like most times. Um, but it kind of gave you like a lot of like excuses, or it kind of like held your hand for the most part. This game does not hold your hand nearly as much as that game. Like this game really kind of like lets you go as you progress deeper into the story. There really isn't like a super like you're insanely OP moment that it's like everything is like super easy. Like no, like this game is like constantly reassuring you and advising you like, hey, do the upgrades, do the archetypes, do the bunch of things you want to do. Speaking of archetypes, this game has a myriad of amount of different like archetypes, or I guess whatever like personas or monsters, whatever you want to call it, depending on the game you play from Atlus. But in this case, it's called archetypes, and there's an insane amount of customization placed into these archetypes. There are specific requirements to gain specific archetypes, especially like the more higher level archetypes. Some of them are kind of annoying because it revolves you around doing social links with other characters, which it's kind of like the game like making you like interact with other characters that you usually don't interact with. An extra thing that I want to congratulate Atlus for doing in this game is the retry mode that they added. Like, let's say you just kind of like are absolutely just getting your ass kicked and like halfway through the fight, and you want to retry it instead of just dying and waiting for a game over screen. You could just click a button there that says to retry, and it'll just take you right from the start of the battle. And it has helped me so much because it has saved me so much time in specific encounters, especially when the final encounters of the game, I was getting my ass kicked halfway through, and I was like, I really don't want to die and repeat this entire phase again, or entire boss fight again. And it just like saved me so much time instead of just trying to do the entire process again. And I think that was a life changer. Like that is a game changer, and it's something that I wish other games can incorporate, especially JRPGs. The OST in this game, as always, is fabulous. Atlus has not missed in a single OST so far, and we have the wonderful Shoji Meguro once again composing an Atlus game, and my mind was blown throughout the entire experience because this man went from producing like Shin Megami Tensei, Persona, the other Atlus game soundtracks, and then to this soundtrack that's insanely orchestral. And I think they actually contacted a Japanese like monk. Was it? I think like in some songs, some battle tracks, you kind of hear like a monk like going off, like doing chants and stuff, like in a completely different language. And it's like insane. It is borderline insanity. Like it's like how does the game who makes the soundtrack like Persona 3, 4, 5, completely different genres, but still like listenable genres, like you can like it's much more accessible to like a full on orchestral like Game of Thrones esque grandiose orchestra. Like it blew my mind, and it just shows that Shoji Meguro is like one of the most, if not the most talented composer there is in the gaming industry right now. A quick thing that I wanted to add for the story part, a little complaint that I have was that there were some occasions where I didn't feel the story was moving nearly as fast as it should have. There are some occasions where it's like repeating the same things that we know, or it's like characters like engaging with this like book of prophecy that you basically have in the beginning of the game. That's like a book about utopia and like a perfect like a perfect world and stuff. And like for some reason you have to see almost every single character you interact with give their own opinion or take on it, and it generally just feels very like annoying because it's like we get it. It's a fictitious world that most people will not believe exists, or they wish it could exist. Like we get it. We don't have to hear it like 20,000 times. There's some occasions where it's like these extended dialogue bits that don't really move that much of this narrative. They kind of like just repeat the same things we already heard of. Thankfully, it doesn't take a huge percentage of the game, but it's kind of noticeable, and sometimes it could stunt the game's progression. Despite all that being said, Metaphor is a step in the right direction for Atlus. Atlus has been kind of milking and banking off of Persona and Shin Megami Tensei for the past couple of years, and I feel that this risk that they took on presenting a completely new IP is really paid off. This is something that I really want to see more of in the future. I want to see Atlus take more risks, create more IPs, if not create more entries for the same franchise. Like there's just so much involved and so much like effort and love put into this game, and I know it took up a lot of efforts and budgets and stuff like that, and it'll probably take like even more years to make a game nearly like this, but it's something that paid off, and I want Atlus to kind of like just see this success and say, hey, maybe we should take more risks instead of like, making the 50th version of Persona 5. Like it proves that like taking risks pays off, especially when it comes to Atlus, because they knew what they were doing here. The story is magnificent for the most part. The voice acting is incredible. Gameplay, OST, everything in here was top notch and was professionally made and well put together. Sure, it had a couple of issues throughout the game that could have been improved a bit more, but for the most part, it's genuinely a stellar game. It is really well put together, and it is something that Atlus should strive to do more of. In terms of a score, I'm gonna give this game an 8.5 out of 10. Some really strong stuff. So yeah, what do you guys think about this game? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Let me know in the comments down below. Give me your thoughts, please. Leave a like in the video if you really enjoyed this review. Comment again, just what you think of the game and everything. And subscribe, turn notification bell on to miss an upload from me. And see you guys next time. Peace out.